Well, I spoke more with Nya Marshall, the CEO and founder of Diomo Development and Ivy Kitchen and Cocktails that Sean just featured in that story, for a deeper sense of what it's like being a black business owner in Detroit during these times. I began by asking her how and why she entered the restaurant industry.
I'm a born and raised Detroit girl. I actually did go that path of the auto industry. I worked as a vice president of director of program management, vice president of program management for almost 17 years in the auto industry. I've done various things in the auto industry. It's kind of what catapulted my entrepreneurial journey, actually.
So let's talk about that, because obviously it is quite a big jump, and it can be quite a risky jump to go into entrepreneurship. Tell us a little about the process of getting your business going and what made you decide to take that route.
Well, I think it kind of happened, during the meltdown here back in 2008. And I felt, although I didn't experience any job loss, many in my family had job loss. So it was like I was living with my siblings again, basically. So many moved into my home, and, you realize how vulnerable you really are over your own personal life at that point. And I started to just think about just making changes and what could I do, what was feasible, in addition to that, it was like a transition of my life, like, because for so many years, culturally, it was kind of a rite of passage. You live in Michigan, you live in Detroit area, you work in the auto industry, and that was your journey. It only took me later and more to become more mature, to be quite honest, before I realized that didn't have to be my only journey, that there can be a part 2, there can be a part 3, and things of that nature.
So what did you tap into to really push yourself to do that, being that obviously a lot of people in Detroit stay in the auto industry? What was it in you that made you say, this is my chance to do something different?
Well, I felt, like I said, very vulnerable and insecure. Fortunately, I work in the auto industry, and the reason that people stay in it is because it can be lucrative. It can be financially rewarding. I felt like I had been pretty smart with my earnings throughout my career. I felt like I didn't live above my means, and this was a good time for me to potentially make some changes and begin to transition. It didn't happen immediately, obviously. It took many, many, many years later for me to transition completely out. In fact, I only transitioned out, less than 6 months ago, officially, completely. And so it took a while. It was a lot of planning and a lot of preparation.
And certainly, as we've seen with the pandemic and obviously the protests as well over the killing of George Floyd, this has been a real shock to the system for a lot of business owners. How are you managing?
Well, we're not, basically. Right now, we are closed. The pandemic primarily cost us to lose 91.5% of our business. I couldn't sustain. And so you combine that with, right when we began to transition out of the pandemic, we start talking about reimagining what that looks like, because it took a long time for people to understand the ramifications of the pandemic, because our leadership did not acknowledge the pandemic in the beginning, so people didn't take it very seriously. And as a result, Detroit was hit really hard by the pandemic. I mean, and I didn't lose any of my own family members, but my neighbor lost both his parents. 2 doors down from me, my other neighbor, her husband died of COVID, a 40-year-old man. And so once we started transitioning out of the pandemic, then the rioting began, basically. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in the business climate right now here in Detroit.
And we know that the government has had its relief program. Obviously, some businesses benefiting more than others. What's the journey been like for you?
Well, I have been successfully locally with a bit of assistance from local organizations. However, from a federal perspective, no. I do know that they are making changes constantly, and I'm hoping that those changes will benefit me. But so far, I have been unsuccessful with receiving any federal funding at all. It takes, when you are a woman of color, a woman period, and especially a woman of color, it's not the same as someone else. You know, it takes a longer period of time for us to get any financial assistance, if we get any at all.